on. So from this point on, anything that you say or put in the chat box will be recorded, to let you know. My name is Leah Watkis. I am a member of the Collaborative Network to End Exploitation, who is hosting this webinar series called Do No Harm, a fresh perspective on anti-human trafficking work. And we're really pleased to have you here joining us for this conversation today. Feel free to introduce yourself, say hello in the chat box, let us know where you're from, what territory you're on, and what brought you to join this webinar series. I am speaking to you through the power of the internet, but I am situated in Toronto, which has been home to many nations since time immemorial, including the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. These nations were irrevocably harmed by the arrival of European settlers who have systematically tried to erase these Indigenous communities and their teachings. In our ongoing journey towards reconciliation, we are relearning the history of this country and this land, critically examining the ways we have benefited from systemic racism, and we are committed to redressing these harms. Just a couple of housekeeping pieces before we move into our formal presentations today. This webinar series is being hosted by Collaborative Network to End Exploitation. All of the presenters who are sharing today are representing their own views. We've invited them because they are experts in their field, and we feel that you have a lot to learn from them. You're going to be muted with your cameras off for the presentation portion. You're invited to chat and ask questions using the chat features. We will be turning off the general chat during the presentation for section today so that it's not too distracting, but you'll still be able to message myself as a host or Varka as another behind the scenes CNEE member who will be helping me to moderate some questions. We are recording. Everybody will have access to this recording later on if you want to rewatch it. And we do have closed captions available. You can turn that feature on the ribbon at the bottom of your screen. Today is part 3 of our webinar series called Do No Harm. The focus of this entire webinar series is on looking at some of the ways that anti-human trafficking work has unintentionally been causing harm to marginalized and oppressed communities, as well as to trafficked and exploited persons. So we're unpacking some of the ways that that happens in the hopes of helping to inform some best practices. So today is part 3. If you missed out on parts 1 and 2, you can go to our Eventbrite page and you can click on their titles and you'll be able to find the videos there. And if you'd like to join us for the following sessions, please do so. It's the same Zoom link for all of our events. As we get started today, some of the assumptions that we are making, we are assuming that you are already familiar with the topic of human trafficking and what anti-human trafficking work entails. So we're not doing human trafficking 101, except in as much as that intersects with the do no harm and anti-oppressive lens. We assume that you are here with good intentions and you want to learn more. We're really thrilled that you're taking an hour out of your day today to come and explore some of these issues, and you've come because you're open to hearing about maybe some things that you could do better, and that's fantastic. We're so glad that you're here to learn. We're assuming that you understand that discomfort is part of growth. You might hear some things today that make you feel a little bit uncomfortable, and that's okay. We're all here to learn and to grow. So we have 2 incredible speakers who are joining us today. One of the names will be familiar because it was on our promotional materials. The other is not. You will have seen Leah Woolner's name in some of our promotional materials. She was unable to join us at the last minute due to some unforeseen circumstances. So we are thrilled and very grateful that Larissa has agreed to step in and help support Natalie in doing this. So thanks so much, Larissa, for stepping in. Thank you, Natalie, for helping to organize to have someone step in at the last minute. So Natalie Drolet joined Migrant Workers Center as executive director and staff lawyer in 2014. Her legal practice focuses on the areas of immigration law and employment law, and she has represented migrant workers before all levels of court in British Columbia. Natalie received her Bachelor of Laws and her Bachelor of Civil Law from McGill University in 2009 and her Master's in Immigration and Settlement Studies from Ryerson University in 2005. Larissa Maxwell is a registered therapist and sought-after leadership consultant and coach in business, healthcare, government, law enforcement, and NGO sectors across North America. She is passionate about leadership that truly moves the dial, strategic action backed up by solid design, and innovation as a response to human suffering. Larissa holds a Master's in Business Administration and is currently the National Director of the Salvation Army Illuminate, overseeing intervention, aftercare services, and global initiatives for survivors of sex and labor trafficking. Larissa was the first recipient of the Canadian Department of Justice's Excellent in Victims Services Award in 2017 and is featured in the labor trafficking documentary Hidden in Plain Sight: Labor Trafficking, Farm Workers, and Migrant Workers in Canada. Larissa is leading multiple groundbreaking projects, including the United Nations Finance Against Modern Slavery Vulnerable Sectors Initiative, UBC's Ethical Storytelling Research, and SLAC's Employment Equity Initiative. Welcome. Thank you so much, Natalie and Larissa, for joining us. I will pass it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Leah. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. I'm just going to share my screen here. Great. So I am joining you today from the unceded ancestral and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the Migrant Workers Center, we were founded in 1986 as the West Coast Domestic Workers Association. The organization is a nonprofit community legal clinic that provides free legal assistance to migrant workers in the province of British Columbia. We work with foreign nationals who are trafficked or exploited for their labor, providing them with direct legal support. And we also work to raise awareness of labor trafficking and advocate for law and policy reform. So on the slide here, mentions some of the services that we offer. We assist migrant workers who faced labor exploitation to apply for open work permits and temporary resident permits. And I'll talk a little bit more about those applications in the presentation. We can also assist people to file complaints with the Employment Standards Branch in BC, the Human Rights Tribunal, WorkSafe BC, and Small Claims Court for employment law violations. And we also assist with immigration applications for work permits and permanent residency. Our main office is located in Vancouver, but we also have a legal team providing support to migrant agricultural workers in the Okanagan region. And our organization has a province-wide mandate. So before I talk about the temporary resident permit for victims of trafficking in persons, which is the main focus of my presentation today, I wanted to just take a step back and discuss some of the risk factors for exploitation and trafficking that migrant workers face under the current temporary immigration programs that bring them to work to Canada. The structure of the temporary foreign worker program itself renders migrant workers vulnerable to abuse, and they are often vulnerable because they come from countries where there is economic instability and inequality, and they seek to have a better life by working here. The temporary foreign worker program depends on there being significant economic inequality between Canada and the countries where the workers are sourced from. And if it wasn't for that inequality, migrant workers wouldn't come to work under the conditions that they do. There has always been a significant power imbalance in relation to migrant workers and their employers. Their precarious immigration status in Canada results in a fear of losing their status and a fear of being deported. Unlike permanent residents and Canadian citizens, migrant workers are tied to their employers. Their work authorization ties them to a single employer, single job, and a single location, and they cannot circulate freely in the labor market. As a result, they are completely dependent on their employers for their jobs and their ability to remain in Canada. They are often socially isolated. They often face language barriers, lack familiarity with the rights they do have under different Canadian laws, lack access to information and services, and overall there is a lack of monitoring and enforcement of the rights that they do have. So all of these conditions make it difficult for workers to negotiate their rights and working conditions, make a complaint against their employer, or leave an abusive employment situation. The threat of job loss and removal from Canada makes migrant workers uniquely vulnerable to control and exploitation and less likely to come forward to report. We know that there are systemic violations of employment standards, occupational health and safety regulations, and human rights because we handle these complaints for workers in our office every day. So now I'm going to turn to talk about the remedies that are available for temporary protection. Often migrant workers who are trafficked or exploited face challenges with regards to their immigration status. So their status may be tied to their trafficker or their abuser, or they may have breached different provisions of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, such as doing unauthorized work. They may have lost their status in Canada due to being coerced by their employer to perform work in violation of the permits that they do have. And if a worker seeks protection in Canada, these are the two recourses that exist currently to access temporary protection. I do want to note that there are no avenues for permanent protection for survivors of trafficking in our country. So the first one is the VTIP-TRP, or the Temporary Resident Permit for Victims of Trafficking, and the second is the Open Work Permit for Vulnerable Workers. So the VTIP-TRP allows survivors to regain status in Canada, usually for a period of up to 6 months. They can access interim federal health, social assistance, and an open work permit through this application. And this option is available to people who have lost their status, whose work permit has expired, or who have otherwise lost their status in Canada. And this TRP would cure their inadmissibility, but only for the duration of the TRP itself. The other remedy that is available is the Open Work Permit for Vulnerable Workers, and this is only available to workers who have a valid work permit. So a work permit that hasn't expired, or if they are on implied status, which means that they had a work permit and they applied to extend it before that initial work permit expired. And if the individual has performed unauthorized work, the guidelines for the vulnerable worker open work permit state that this would not be a barrier for them to receive a work permit. In our experience, both of these remedies are difficult to access. The main difference between the two are the eligibility requirements in terms of immigration status, but there are other differences as well. So the TRP itself is an exceptional remedy under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act for people who are inadmissible to Canada. The vulnerable open work permit, as I mentioned, is for people who have immigration status. So this vulnerable worker open work permit was established in June of 2019. And at that time, it held promise for, as a remedy for vulnerable workers. But in reality, the last time we checked statistics, which was in the fall of 2020, only about 50% of applications submitted had been approved. So on this slide, I'm showing you the different sort of what you could call a legal test that officers apply when deciding whether or not to issue a permit under these two remedies. So the temporary resident permit For the preliminary assessment, which under which an officer can issue a permit of up to 6 months, there is a two-part test. So first, the officer will look at whether the individual may be a victim. They do not have to decide definitively whether that individual is a victim, but if there are indications that they may be a victim, according to the following indicators of exploitation, then they can be justified in issuing a permit. So we can see here that if a person, the applicant can demonstrate that they experienced fraudulent or coerced recruitment for the purpose of exploitation, if they were coerced into employment, if they had exploitative employment conditions, or if their freedom was restricted in some way, then they may be eligible to get a TRP. However, the test for the TRP does not end there. There is a second part to the test, and that is there a purpose for issuing the TRP? So even if the applicant has established that they have experienced exploitation and may be a victim of trafficking, that is not enough to get protection. They also need to demonstrate that they have an accepted purpose for their need to remain in Canada. Now, for the open work permit for vulnerable workers, on the other hand, the applicant must establish that they experienced abuse or that they were at risk of abuse in the context of their employment in Canada. And abuse can take 4 different forms. It could include physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, or financial abuse. And for this permit, there is no purpose test. It is enough for the individual to demonstrate that they've experienced abuse or are at risk in order to get a permit. So what does this mean? Well, it means that we have a piecemeal approach to protecting vulnerable migrant workers and migrants. These 2 different tests are ultimately trying to achieve the same thing, giving someone protection by allowing an individual to remain in Canada for a finite period of time because they've experienced or are at risk of experiencing exploitation or abuse. And there are parallels between the 2. So the descriptions of exploitation are comparable. For instance, the examples given in the TRP test can be understood as examples of the different forms of abuse. Depending on the circumstances of the case, fraudulent recruitment can be understood as a form of financial abuse if they had to pay recruitment fees, and potentially psychological abuse if false promises were made to the worker about the employment opportunity. But there is a major difference, and this is that the TRP requires that an applicant clearly articulates a purpose to remain in Canada, and the application can be refused if the immigration officer decides that there is not a sufficient purpose for them to remain, even if they have found that they experienced exploitation. So I'll discuss this a little bit more on the next slide. And then there are a couple of differences between these 2 applications that appear to be a bit arbitrary as well, which I'll discuss next. So with respect to challenges and limits to protection, I am going to focus a little bit on the TRP, but some of these challenges are applicable to both types of applications. So number 1 is that interview procedures undermine fairness and are not trauma-informed. In some cases involving TRPs, decisions have been rendered by immigration officers without an interview, which deprives the applicant the opportunity to be heard. In one case, we challenged a refusal of subsequent TRP applications. This would be an extension of a TRP application. On judicial review in the Federal Court of Canada, we won the case with the judge ruling that the immigration officer overlooked important evidence about that individual's need to remain in Canada to access therapy and counseling. And the application was remitted by the judge to immigration for another officer to make a new decision. The officer refused the application within 10 days and did not provide that individual with an interview or an opportunity to submit any new evidence or information to support the application. Now, for both the VTIP TRP and the Vulnerable Worker Open Work Permit, we've heard from clients time and time again that they felt intimidated during interviews, and that this was due to officer conduct, which impacted their ability to provide full information to the officers. Several clients have reported that they were unable to fully express themselves because they were cut off by officers and they were not able to provide complete answers. Some clients reported being yelled at by officers and indicated that the officer appeared to be angry with them. Nearly all of the clients we've assisted have stated that they've experienced anxiety during interviews, and all of these reasons reflect the need for a trauma-informed approach during these interviews. And this is also compounded by the fact that certain IRCC offices have made it a practice of barring the individual counsel to attend interviews with clients. So for clients who've experienced trauma and abuse, having counsel present is often an essential support for the client to be able to fully present their case. And that's just simply not always happening. Number two, the risk of enforcement or removal is a major disincentive to workers to come forward. So it's very important for individuals who've experienced exploitation or trafficking to understand the process around applying for a temporary resident permit and the implications of being granted or denied the TRP. If the person is granted a TRP, they will have legal status in Canada and the benefits that I described earlier, but only for the duration of the TRP. In BC, a TRP can receive provincial benefits such as income assistance, for instance. If the person is not issued a TRP, they may be required to leave Canada. And it is common practice for IRCC officers to send individuals a voluntary departure confirmation form with their refusal letter. So when workers hear that they may be at risk of removal for coming forward to report abuse to immigration, this often has a chilling effect. Number three, officers are not applying the guidelines consistently. So for both VTIP TRPs and vulnerable worker open work permits, we have found that there's a great deal of inconsistency and confusion around what constitutes evidence of exploitation or abuse. Officers have rejected applications despite the presence of detailed evidence of wage theft by employers and or the payment of exorbitant illegal recruitment fees for jobs. So for instance, in a number of cases, despite finding that a worker had been charged recruitment fees, the officer rejected this as evidence of abuse or exploitation because the payment was willing and not coerced. So this analysis fails to recognize that the charging of recruitment fees to workers is prohibited by domestic and international law due to the potential for exploitation, and that a worker's willingness to pay is often vitiated by fraud by recruiters and consultants and workers' lack of knowledge of their rights. For VTIP TRPs, we found that there's a great deal of inconsistency around the purpose test. This is the test that is only applicable for TRPs. The TRP requires an assessment of a purpose for the applicant to remain in Canada, and the guidelines do provide some guidance on this. A purpose could be a period of reflection, to recover from physical and mental trauma, to escape the influence of a trafficker, or to participate in an investigation of an alleged trafficking offense.
Hi, Natalie. Sorry to interrupt. I've got a couple of messages that people are having trouble hearing you. If you could speak a little bit, please.
Oh, sure. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so so in our experience, the purpose test has been applied extremely narrowly by immigration officers. VTIP TRPs are challenging to get unless law enforcement is actively investigating the case or if there is an ongoing criminal prosecution. So this is despite the fact that the guidelines indicate clearly that TRPs do not depend, or the issuance of TRPs do not depend on cooperation with police or upon legal standing and police investigation, but in practice, they're rarely issued if police are not investigating. So this is further compounded by the fact that law enforcement rarely investigates labor trafficking cases. There has only been one successful conviction for labor trafficking in Canada since we've had laws on the books, which go back to 2002 under the immigration law and 2005 under the criminal code. So in decisions for VTIP TRPs, we're seeing many applications rejected based on the purpose test. So even though extensive evidence has been put forward demonstrating that an applicant requires time in Canada to recover from mental trauma, This evidence is frequently ignored by officers, and applications are consistently refused on the basis that police are not investigating a case for a trafficking offense. So the next two limits, the short duration and the fact that the VTIP TRP is not available to dependents, illustrate two areas where there are differences between the TRP and the vulnerable worker open work permit. So in theory, a VTIP TRP can be issued for longer than 6 months, but this is extremely rare. Meanwhile, the vulnerable open work permit, if approved, can be approved for 12 months. And we've seen many cases where they are approved for 12 months. And the rationale for this is that in the guidelines for the vulnerable worker open work permit, it states that it may take up to 12 months for a worker to find a new employer with the proper paperwork that they need to get a new work permit, so the LMIA or the labor market impact assessment. What I would like to say is that 6 months and even 12 months is not long enough for an individual to heal from the trauma that they've experienced as a result of exploitation or trafficking. And if an individual is given a 6-month TRP initially and they're not able to get that extended, when that TRP expires, they really have few options. They may be forced to go underground if it is not safe or possible for them to return to their country of origin. And while the vulnerable worker open work permit is available to dependents, so this would be if the applicant has a spouse or children in Canada, they can also get an open work permit, but that is not the case for the TRPs. So I realized that I'm taking a little longer than I was expecting. So I was going to do a case study, but I'm actually going to skip that and just move to the next slide, which is, provide some of my thoughts around how we can move forward. So I think that the way forward really involves a reimagining of Canada's immigration system in terms of how protection is offered to survivors of abuse, exploitation, and trafficking. What we have now is a piecemeal approach that is failing, and I think it is time for Canada to look hard at how we can be doing a better job of protecting vulnerable foreign nationals. So every survivor of abuse should have the right to seek protection and have their applications reviewed in a fair process by specially trained immigration officers, regardless of their immigration status. And these are just some of my ideas of things that could be features of this new class based on what we've learned in dealing with these applications over the years. So allow applicants to restore or regularize their status through an open work permit for a minimum of 12 months. Remove the requirement to assess for a purpose for temporary protection. I think if someone has demonstrated that they've experienced abuse or exploitation, it follows that that there is likely a need for them to remain in Canada to access protection. Provide training to officers on assessing evidence of exploitation flexibly and sensitively. This is really key. And on conducting interviews from a trauma-informed approach. I'd like to suggest that we uncouple the TRP from Section 24 of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, which sees, which provides that a TRP is an exceptional remedy, and actually provide a robust set of rights within our immigration law to ensure that individuals can access protection. I think that this would go a long way as far as prevention. If individuals are empowered to come forward and access protection, they will be much more likely to seek justice through the criminal law system, through civil law systems, which will play a role in preventing these types of abuse from happening in the first place. Also, from a prevention lens, looking at ways that we can offer permanent residence on arrival for an economic class that actually reflects Canada's genuine labor market shortages, which are often in the lower wage, semi-skilled and entry-level jobs, in order to allow individuals to come with secure status so that they are not as vulnerable to experience abuse. And at a minimum, issue open work permits. employer-specific work permits are problematic for all of the reasons that I mentioned earlier on in the presentation, and offering pathways to permanent residency for all essential workers. So I'll end it there, but I'd be happy to take any questions at the end. Thank you. I'll turn it over to you, Larissa.
Great. Hi, everyone. Let me make sure I can share my screen properly here. Let's see if this works well. Are we seeing a nice slide, nice and clear? And you're not seeing my notes? No one can sneak ahead?
Looks good, Larissa.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to jump in today. As the secondary speaker, Natalie brought this up to me just late last week, but I had a few thoughts in light of this conversation of do no harm. So today I want to talk about labor trafficking and the appraisal of value on this issue, particularly as it relates to migrant workers. I see many familiar names on this list, so it's really great to see many of our partners across Canada. For those of you that aren't familiar, my name is Larissa Maxwell, and I am the director of the Salvation Army Illuminate. So Illuminate is the brand home for all of our anti-human trafficking programs in British Columbia. They started over 11 years ago, and you might know us for Deborah's Gate, which is our high security safe house. It's our kind of most famous program. But over the years, we've actually developed quite a few direct services, as well as initiatives. Some of those initiatives are also survivor-led. And between the two, we typically see about 1,200 survivors per year. Although we're in British Columbia, we work with survivors anywhere in Canada. And so it's given us an interesting perspective. So today I want to talk a little bit about systemic challenges and perceptions when it comes to the issue of trafficking and labor trafficking and migrant workers. So over the course of our 11 years so far at Illuminate, and I've been in the field now 16, we have worked equally with survivors of labor and sex trafficking, as well as individuals who have experienced organ and tissue trafficking as well. And so our collective work is around 15,000 survivors. And I don't share those numbers in a sense to brag about it. I share in the sense that there's a really, really vast set of experiences. So as a result, we've walked with a lot of migrant workers who have experienced all forms of exploitation and trafficking that I've noted. And through this firsthand, we've seen some systemic challenges and perceptions that actually exacerbate the issue. So today in our short time, I want to talk about three in the hope of shifting our perspectives, maybe opening up some dialogue, causing us to reevaluate some of our approaches and to inspire some approaches to actually move the dial to end human trafficking in Canada. So I want to talk about the perception of migrant workers, trafficking hierarchies, and criminal justice inadequacies. So I am going to speak a bit from a service provider perspective, but I also will say that some of what I'm going to include is what we see on a systems level crossing many industries. So just to get us started here, for those that are familiar and those that aren't, the Temporary Foreign Worker Program was formed in 1973. And if you note in its own title, it was designed to be temporary. So migrant workers are brought to Canada. This is our action to do this from source countries. And some of the big ones are Guatemala, Philippines, Mexico, Jamaica, to fill labor market shortages and actually to prop up our economy. They are essential from an economic perspective. We actually cannot have a competitive market and an efficient supply chain without them. Typically, employment agencies, and you can see on this visual, and immigration consultants broker the pathway to Canada between kind of where the global work shortage is and between Canadian employers. And then governments set the regulatory standards between the workers, employers, and the system itself. As Natalie mentioned, there's three main streams. There's the high wage stream, which you might be familiar with, the low wage stream, and the primary agricultural stream. The low wage and agricultural stream is where we as an organization have seen widespread exploitation. And sometimes it's targeted, sometimes it's opportunistic, but we've seen a real lack of protection, awareness, and support for workers. Most streams do not result, as Natalie noted, in permanent residency or the ability to even apply for permanent residency, which also creates power imbalances and opportunities for trafficking. So just to kind of dive in a little bit deeper, I want to talk about some of the perceptions and some of the realities. The first problem here is that this program is not temporary. Year after year, Canada requires higher and higher amounts of migrant workers. A temporary structure is not built to house an infrastructure such as this. And I would argue the cracks are starting to show. Before COVID-19, over 40% of Canadian employers reported labor shortages, and 15% or 130,000 jobs are predicted to be left unfilled in my home province of BC by 2028. These are the government's projections, just for one province. In 2017, Canada issued 340,000 new work permits. In 2018, 390,000. And since 2019, 470,000. So this labor market shortage, this problem, it's not temporary, it's not going away. And yet we're not building an infrastructure to properly source workers that balances out their needs as well as ours. Right now, it's a pretty one-sided system. What we have built since the program inception is often in response to abuse. So like if there's been any adjustments, it's remedial or it's after the fact. So like Natalie touched on, the open work permit for vulnerable workers, you only need that if you've actually experienced some form of abuse versus it being preventative in nature. Yet it is completely within our power as a country to make this a safe work program. Additionally, low-skilled and agricultural streams are essential jobs. And I think that all of a sudden came out in COVID-19 where people realized that caring for our children and elderly, farming and harvesting our food, maintaining our businesses, even building our businesses, this is essential. We actually do have an unemployment rate in Canada. Right now it's 9.4%, which has increased as a result of COVID-19. Yet these are jobs that Canadians don't want to do. And as a result, the jobs start to be seen in perception as more menial, kind of less than, and they become part of an invisible caste system that's in our developed societal framework. Additionally, we have seen in our experience in many ways, subtle but very real sentiments that say things like, migrant workers supporting our economy, they're lucky to be here because we're a developed country. We've also still seen the sentiment that they're taking jobs away from Canadians, which couldn't be farther than the truth. Also, this sentiment that they should be willing to do jobs that are borderline exploitive since their skill set or their language competency might be labeled low in comparison to a Canadian. So again, if you're just tuning in, these are perceptions that we're seeing. They are wildly inaccurate. They might be quite subtle, but we know that they root deep and they contribute to trickle-down effects of racism, elitism, sexism, and much more. And I want to propose to you how, at least one way I've seen this happen. So in my 16 years of work in this field, almost exclusively, the only topic I'm asked to teach on, mentor, develop programs for, are related to sex trafficking. When I insist on the inclusion of labor trafficking and things that would affect some of the migratory work to Canada, it often requires an extensive explanation from me. And it's asked to be a side note, like, yep, you can touch on it at the end of your presentation versus giving it the attention that it deserves. A prominent and vocal leader, I'm not going to name them out of respect, but a vocal leader that many of you would know in the human trafficking field even said to me just a year ago, isn't most labor stuff to do with green cards anyways? It didn't work out, time to go home, better luck next time. Sex trafficking is where the real trauma occurs and where our resources should go. Wow, not only is that inaccurate, but it's a really dangerous perception. There's a hierarchy that continues to be created in Canada, and it essentially says sex trafficking is worse, it's more local, it's more pervasive, and therefore it's probably more important than labor trafficking. I will say from a therapeutic perspective, this might be rooted in some of the historical trauma counseling praxis that often identify sexual trauma as the worst and most pervasive form of trauma. But modern trauma praxis has found that's not completely accurate. It's also a huge misconception that labor trafficking doesn't involve sexual exploitation. In our experience, we see an interchange of labor trafficked persons exploited sexually and sexually exploited persons also trafficked for labor. Categories sometimes help, but sometimes they hinder. The kinds of abuses that we've seen in labor trafficking and in our aftercare services to migrant workers are tantamount to transatlantic slavery. We're talking very, very serious forms of abuse. Sex trafficking is also perceived as more enticing and voyeuristic. In fact, we as a society consume and we hunger for the trauma pornography that we create out of the sex trafficking narrative. And we often use that to motivate our action, and it results in a lot of unethical storytelling and advocacy exploitation of survivors. The offenders in sex trafficking can seem more nefarious, you know, like we see in the movies. You've got gangs and pimps and predators, and the cruelty of the abuse seems a lot more torturous. Labor trafficking and the plight of migrant workers just doesn't seem as sympathetic or engaging, or when it is talked about, it's told from a lens of privilege that downplays their rights, their capabilities, and the protections that they need. But I can assure you, migrant workers have experienced some of the most horrific and torturous abuse I have seen in my 16 years of work in this field. So this kind of comparison that's subtle, it's not helpful. Sex trafficking, rightly so, also highlights the overrepresentation of self-identifying women and girls, LGBTQ two-spirit plus folks, Black, Indigenous, and person of color identifying folks that are targeted. But the one thing I would mention is sometimes this can alienate gender diverse and male victims because we're not really talking about all forms of trafficking. It also causes funding to be solely aimed at female identifying projects, and some victims, including families and intergenerational impacts, end up being underserved. If you look closely, you will find the trafficking hierarchy in Canada. If you want evidence of this, look at the government and private funding strategies, look at the awareness campaigns, the prevention work and youth work. How often is labor included? And in that, how often migrant workers? How many conferences in our field give equal attention? How many lawyers have filed unconstitutional challenges to IRPA and the criminal code as it relates to exploitive labor and our failure to apply these protections for migrant workers? How often do we teach competencies related to migrant workers in our schools and our training colleges? What projects do we create to house exploited and trafficked migrant workers? What healthcare approaches to support those without status? Legal support, such as Natalie's speaking about, for those who need to reinstate status or apply for TRPs and open work permits, humanitarian and compassionate ground permanent residency applications. I will acknowledge, thankfully, there are some projects growing, and I know some of those agencies are on this call today. So we thank you for that work. But I will say that work is a bit behind and it's underfunded, or it's funded as one project out of 12, kind of as a token exception. So do we have a sex trafficking problem in Canada? Absolutely we do. No one needs to downplay that. I'm glad we're finally talking about that. But lest we neglect, we have a labor trafficking problem too. And that is disproportionately affecting those we actually bring to Canada to prop up our economy. It is caused by us on a systemic level, and it's completely within our grasp to address it and eradicate it. It's also the kind of exploitation, I want to point out, that every single one of us consumes through supply chains. You may not consume sexual services that could potentially exploit someone, but we all consume labor and labor products, some of which can be exploitive. Yet it persists. And I propose this could be as a result of this subtle ranking that we see in terms of a hierarchy of trafficking. So I just want to challenge something today, an end to the hierarchy. You know, survivors of all forms of trafficking, they have seen this and they've already affirmed this publicly. It's time that all of us do the same. The last thing I want to talk about in this really short time period, I know these are weighty topics, so if you're feeling like, whoa, there's lots to talk about, I agree. We're just kind of scratching the surface, but there's one more I want to talk about. I want to talk about criminal justice inadequacy. So I'm an instructor at some major police colleges in Canada, some major universities. And in my role, I have worked with over 50 trafficking-specific law enforcement agencies, including municipal, provincial, federal, Indigenous, and immigration policing services. I have been a victim service worker and support at hundreds of criminal proceedings, and only one in my entire career has been for labor. My hat's off to the law enforcement agencies that have followed through, but in general, we see an alarming trend. I have to insist when I instruct that labor is included. And in a recent evaluation of my session where I did include labor, an officer in a human trafficking unit wrote, "Cut the labor, it's not relevant to my work." Others care, or they're interested in the issue. So I have seen that as well, but they have no means or systemic support to do something about it. So last year, just to give you an idea from at least our limited perspective, we supported 1,200 survivors through Illuminate, and 80% of those participated in criminal justice of some kind with law enforcement. At least 40% of that 80 are survivors of labor trafficking, yet not a single trafficking charge under IRPA or the criminal code was laid last year in any of that information that was brought forward. Often when reporting, it's batted around between police services and agencies. It's often considered too resource intensive because it does require connection with other countries, or it's not even in the wheelhouse of those who could investigate it. So it ends up getting lost. The majority of officers that are legally able to lay charges related to IRPA are not trained nor aware of the relevant sections. Many of the police services share they have no labor cases. So therefore, we're going to focus on sex trafficking. But when I ask them further, there hasn't been a single proactive investigation, not one. We know with trafficking, if you don't look, you won't find it. But if you lift the rock, sometimes you find it all over the place. So if you just expect it to come to you, as Natalie mentioned, there's all kinds of barriers as to why that doesn't happen. But even when it does come to them directly, we're really not seeing those go forward. Some of the provinces and territories actually have a handoff policy, meaning, well, if we take this in, it has to go to here, it has to go to there. And what happens is it just gets lost in the abyss. The other piece is that law enforcement is tied to immigration, which complicates proceedings if there's precarious status within the mix, which usually there is. Almost all human trafficking focused units don't work on labor cases, which means general policing tries to tackle the complexity if they take it on at all, which is very difficult for them. We know when it comes to these kind of investigations, you do actually need specialization. Most labor survivors, and me and Natalie have seen this firsthand, they're told to go civil instead. So file a human rights tribunal complaint, file an employment standards complaint. But this diminishes the purpose of criminal justice, both as a reflection of crimes against our society that we don't stand for, but also, as Natalie pointed out to me, a deterrent. It also may result in a financial award, but it's typically like civil, for example, but that financial award is typically what's owed to the person for their unpaid labor. It's not crime victim compensation funding or compensation for pain and suffering. It's not super high, and it results in little or no restriction of the offenders, such as jail time, punitive fines, restrictions on content or access. So civil has its purpose, but so does criminal. Lastly, as Natalie mentioned, IRPA has been used a handful of times, literally a handful, where the criminal code currently right now in stats is at over 2,000 charges, but they're primarily sex trafficking oriented charges. So I just want to challenge us to think about this today and to build the criminal justice competency and support for migrant workers and those that are affected by labor exploitation and trafficking. So I'm going to close with just a few thoughts on this. Migrant workers who've experienced labor trafficking and exploitation have experienced clinical complex trauma. I can tell you that. Type 2, repeated exposure to injury and harm. Things like physical violence, humiliation, confinement, torture, financial control, sexual violence, and much more. We run really intensive aftercare programs, and victims of labor and sex trafficking both require the same amount of aftercare from a psychosocial perspective. It just looks different. And of course, they've experienced different things, but it doesn't mean that one necessarily needs more attention than the other. So for this series on fresh perspectives to anti-trafficking work, I want to put this challenge forward to all of you. Have we been remiss in our treatment of labor trafficking? Have we allowed systemic factors such as racism or sexism or colonialism or elitism to develop these new and hidden caste structures for migrant workers in Canada? Have we identified and acknowledged that we all consume this labor and therefore we're all consuming the abuse as well? And lastly, can we eliminate some of these hierarchies that are starting to build and really invest in ending trafficking in Canada in all forms? I propose we do this by evaluating our attitudes, valuing migrant workers, not just in our word, but in our actions, break down the hierarchies and invest in our systems, such as Natalie spoke about, around immigration, regulation, and criminal justice, to communicate strongly that we do not tolerate this in our labor market. So I put that forward to the group today in humbleness, knowing it's a huge conversation, But I will say a few survivors also contributed to some of this content today to bring forward from their perspective of experiencing labor trafficking and exploitation as migrant workers. So wanting to hear also some of the things that they're raising forward that we can do to actually end labor trafficking in Canada. So I will leave us at that.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Larissa and Natalie, for both of your presentations and for all of the passion and energy that you bring both to this presentation and to the work that you do on a regular basis for people who are being exploited. Thank you. So we've got 10 minutes left for some question and answer. We've turned the chat function back on, so you can drop your questions there, or you can use the raise hand function if you'd like to speak. We have a question here. It's now moving so quickly. What are migrant workers told by the Canadian government about what their job will include?
I can take a stab at that one. So if someone is applying for a work permit to come to Canada, there are a number of documents that they must provide to immigration as part of that work permit application. So one of those is a copy of the labor market impact assessment that the employer has received from Employment and Social Development Canada, which essentially gives permission to an employer to hire a foreign national instead of a Canadian citizen or permanent resident for a particular job. And that labor market impact assessment document has some information about the obligations that employers undertake as a result of hiring a foreign national. So this includes things like they must abide by provincial territory labor laws, for instance, as well as all of the terms and conditions of the temporary foreign worker program itself. So the worker has that copy of the labor market impact assessment. The worker is also required to submit a copy of the employment contract. So they must have a contract with the employer that details what the terms of employment are, what the job is, what the working conditions are, the number of hours per week, the wage rate, any vacation entitlements, et cetera, et cetera. So in theory, the worker is supposed to, have access to all of those documents and understand, the parameters of the job that they are coming to Canada to do. But what often occurs is that there is often an intermediary involved, a labor broker or an immigration consultant who is handling all the paperwork. And so we do see that workers may not be aware of the terms of the contract. They may have signed it, but they may not have had the opportunity to read it or understand it in its entirety. It may not have been provided to them in their language. And so there are often, misunderstandings about what their rights are under the contract. And then compounded with that is the fact that workers do not receive any information about their rights from the Canadian government. So there are opportunities for the government to give workers some basic information about their rights, as well as, some resources for them to turn to if they experience difficulties in Canada. But none of those opportunities are being utilized. So one opportunity would be when the worker is issued their visa to travel to Canada. So this would be a visa in their passport that they, that they take with them to the airport to board the plane. That at the embassy, when they pick up their passport or when they receive their passport, they could be given a pamphlet, right? But they're not given any information. When they arrive at the airport in Canada and they hand, their passport to the CBSA officer, who will then issue them with the work permit, at the airport, they are also not provided with any documentation about their rights or any phone numbers that they could call. So, these are things that seem pretty simple to implement, but they haven't been. even though there's been, efforts on the part of organizations to advocate for this type of thing. Unfortunately, workers often come to Canada without really having any basic information at all about what their rights are.
Thanks, Natalie, for that answer. I have another question here. What can we do to help push the suggestions that you both put forward? So people are asking what is it that they can do to help push this narrative forward? So maybe Larissa, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the pieces I would say is that in other forms of trafficking, we all can kind of go like this and be like, well, I'm not consuming it, but let's do something to end it. Sorry, you can't do that with labor. It's just unfortunately too woven into our supply chains. So I think there's a piece of recognizing when it comes to this issue, and it disproportionately affects migrant workers. We have seen some individuals exploited and trafficked who are Canadians. We have seen that in the context of sex trafficking as well. But when it comes to migrant workers, there is pieces here for us in terms of our consumerism, our ethical consumerism, and our purchasing patterns. I know just here in BC, for example, like one of the largest blueberry farms that actually sources a lot of Canada and US and even Japan was just found to have severely exploited workers. Not a single criminal charge was laid, but there's quite a bit on WorkSafe and employment standards, a huge group of Guatemalan workers. I have consumed those blueberries, and many of us probably have. So I think the first thing I would say is actually we need to start there. And part of it is not realizing that we have purchasing power. We also have an ability of the places that we purchase to actually demand them to look at their supply chains. There actually is a bill before hearing right now in looking at Canadian supply chains and transparency in that. So that's the first thing I would say. The second I want to challenge and promote, if you say that you work in trafficking, work in all forms. And I know that's challenging and complex. There's a lot more training and opportunities, and there seems like there's more demand for sex trafficking. I would argue that's not the case. And that's not ever been the case in our work. It does take some time and for us to build our practice and our discipline in that. It doesn't mean you can't specialize, of course, but I think we see it really tilted. And what it does is it starts to change perceptions that something is more important than another. And we've learned that in domestic violence. Let's not create typologies of what abuse is worse than others. That doesn't help anyone. And so that would be sort of my second challenge. Is it in your practice, and why not? Is there a justifiable reason that you're not working with this population? Are we creating barriers in some of our social service programs requiring ID, status, access to income assistance, all things that a lot of migrant workers may not have if they've been exploited? So that would be sort of my second challenge. Natalie, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything you said really resonates with me, Larissa. I also maybe could just add something else into the mix, which is, that a lot of what I'm talking about, or what I was talking about, is legislative change. Legislative change requires a few different things to be successful, one of which is political will, which is lacking currently. However, I think, the more that we can speak up, and anyone can do this, anyone can write to their MP, can pick up the phone and call their MP's office to let them know that they are genuinely concerned about this issue and that something needs to be done, is helpful, right? Because politicians will act when they see that their constituents are genuinely concerned and pushing them for change, right? So I would just encourage everyone, if you're looking for something you can do today or tomorrow, pick up the phone and call your MP and let them know that you attended the presentation, that you learned about the barriers that migrant workers face, and that you would support, things like granting permanent residency to all essential workers, especially in the context of this pandemic. Never underestimate the power of a few individuals to make change.
Yes. I have one more piece I would add that kind of falls in line with Natalie. As some of you know, some of our federal government bodies have been creating human trafficking action plans, consultations. Some of you know public safety, wage has done a bit of work around that. And labor trafficking is included, but you will notice it's a little more of a footnote than it is really equally treated. I've actually been putting forward challenges, and I would encourage all of you, we need to see a labor trafficking action plan at both ESDC and IRCC. There actually needs to be a comprehensive strategy. If we're not at the place of dismantling the temporary foreign worker program, which I would argue we probably do need to rebuild the entire program. However, if we're not going to, we absolutely need a strategy that's going to look more at prevention. Right now, everything is remediation. So now we're like, well, if it happens to someone, it's actually ridiculous that we have a program we've created that has ample opportunity for exploitation, and we have not been able to eradicate that. Like it's actually quite ridiculous. So it's time for us to do that and do it strategically. I agree with Natalie's point, but I also believe like it needs to come from an internal place, because there's quite a few players that are at the table here, not just kind of one federal body. So that would be my other challenge to put forward.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was a great combination of like what we can do as individuals, what we can do as organizations, what can be done at the legislative level. You hit on so many different pieces there in such a short period of time. So I want to thank you so much once again for stepping up, for taking the time to come and speak to us today. I want to thank all of our participants. We're really glad we had over 100 participants today, because we knew that this is a 6-part series, and this is the one that focuses on labor trafficking, and it had the fewest number of registrants because there is more interest in the other areas of human trafficking and labor exploitation. So thank you to all of you who joined us here today. We'll be saying goodbye now, but please do check back on our Eventbrite page to find the recording of this, and to see the details of our upcoming webinars that we hope that you will be joining us for. So thanks everyone, and have a great rest of your day.